All right, today we shift over to look at things on the server side. So I want to review the purpose of server-side scripting, talk a little bit about it in general terms, and then we'll look at some specific examples. So we drew this diagram way at the beginning of class, first day probably, first or second day. We have a client, which for the most part, you can't see because I didn't turn on the projector. When I talk about client, I mean someone that's, running a web browser. There's other kinds of clients as well, but the ones that we're most concerned about is someone running a web browser, whether it be on a mobile device, on a desktop device, gaming console, whatever. It's connected through the internet, makes requests that through the magic of the internet get routed to the appropriate web server. And the server delivers HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, in the case of static web pages, in other words, just plain old HTML files, the server's job is easy. It simply takes the HTML files that were created and just directs them back to the client. So if you had a very simple website, let's say a website for a restaurant, it's a static. It doesn't change much, right? The restaurant's always going to be at the same place. Their menu's set for at least for a long time. It's set. They probably don't change it every day or every week even, or every month probably. So you might have static pages, just plain old HTML pages that are static. And by static, I mean that they don't change. Or a better way to say it is it takes a person actually editing the HTML to make the changes to the web pages. So in that case, a client makes a request through the internet, it gets to the server, and the server responds back with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then we spent the last 7 weeks of the semester talking about how JavaScript can make the page interactive. And we can alter the page without reloading it. So for example, the assignment that you have, I think it's due this week, where you have an accordion control on the page. You're not getting a new copy of the page. You're working with the existing page. You're clicking on one thing and you're making a different section appear. You click on another thing and another section appears, and so on down the line. All right. So that happens without getting a new copy of the page. All right. That happens on the client side. In other words, the page that was loaded initially changes some way based on your actions. So that's what I mean by interactive. Now, most web pages are not static HTML web pages. All right. Those were popular in the very early days of the web, but now web pages act more like applications than just a brochure, an electronic brochure. So what we're going to have is we're going to have server-side scripts. And our language of choice is going to be PHP. Now the server has a little bit bigger job when you request a PHP page, because PHP is not HTML. All right. PHP is a different language. And web browsers don't understand PHP. If we're going to talk about this delivered item as being like a sandwich that you order at a fast food place, PHP is like the recipe to make the sandwich. So if I went to Subway and ordered a turkey Cali club, they're not going to hand me a sheet of paper that says, well, this is how you make it, right? Because I don't have the equipment to make it. I don't have the oven to roast it in, and I don't have the ingredients out there, and I can't do it. I rely on them to do it. So the server-side script are like recipes or instructions of what the web page is going to look like. So the server has to first process those scripts, and the output of those scripts is an HTML and CSS page. A page that contains HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the server has more work. We're going to take that PHP and we're going to translate it. We're going to execute the code, and we're going to come up with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to send back to the client. Okay, now, in order to do that, we actually need a web server on our machine. All right, because with our web pages, we didn't really, with our static HTML pages, we really didn't have a web server, right? We just double-clicked on files and they opened. All right, the operating system was smart enough to know, hey, here's an HTML file, let me open it up within a browser. So it did that, and that was okay because browsers understand HTML, and if you give it an HTML file, it can display it the way that you want it to display. I can't do that with PHP files. PHP files, again, typically end with a .php extension, all right? If I double-click on a PHP file, the browser doesn't know what to do with it, all right? Because, again, it's a recipe, it's instructions for creating a page and not a page itself. So it needs to be processed through a server. So that means that you need to have a web server. Now, how do you know if you have a web server or not on your machine? One way to do it would be to go to your web browser, open up a tab, and typing in localhost. And I got this. Localhost means the web server running on your machine. Now I got this. I'm running on this machine Microsoft's Internet Information Services. All right. So this machine already has a web server installed. All right. If you do that and you don't get anything and it says something like, you know, address doesn't exist or whatever, then you need to install a web server. Alternately, you can type in, as per the t-shirt today or sweatshirt today, 127.0.0.1. That's the IP address of your local machine, and you should get the same thing. Yeah, get the same thing. So let's say you do not have a web server installed on your machine. What can you do? Well, what I would suggest you do, there's probably several ways that you could address this, but what I would say, suggest that you do is install a web server called XAMPP. And I've heard it pronounced a bunch of different ways. I've heard it pronounced as XAMPP, you know, with the X. So I don't know what the right pronunciation is. I've always called it XAMPP. And XAMPP is cross-platform. So whether you have a Mac, a Linux machine, a Windows machine, you can always run XAMPP. It's pretty easy to install. I have a little video I made about installing it, and it should be, even though it might be the video might be made a few years back, it should still be valid. So if you need to install it, watch that. And you can just Google XAMPP. And it tells you what you have, and you can install it. You can download it and install it. There should be questions here about if it doesn't work. If you have any trouble doing this, let me know, email me. Now, this unit is an introductory unit on PHP. And it so happens that it happens the week before spring break. So your next assignment isn't due for a while. Your next assignment isn't due until March 27th. Why did I give you so much time? Well, one of the reasons I give you so much time is because next week is spring break. And you're certainly welcome to work during spring break. I will be checking my email just like normal. There will be no lectures. There will be no labs. There will be no scheduled office hours during spring break. But you can still send me an email if you're running into problems, and I'll be happy to answer that. You can also schedule an appointment to meet with me online if you're having difficulty with something. So just because it's a break doesn't mean that I stop working. All right. And I do hope the weather stays what it's been the last couple of days. I'm not sure what the forecast is. And that we all have at least a little bit of time to rest and relax and so on. So that's the reason for one of these weeks, extra weeks that I've given you here, because normally the next lab would be due the 13th. I've given you an extra week because I want to make absolutely certain that you get your web server installed and installed correctly. And we already talked about what that means. You have a web server installed correctly if when you type in localhost, you get a page that pops up. And it might, if you already, for example, had IIS installed, it would just pop up and say the similar screen to what I have. If you have XAMPP installed, it would show an XAMPP equivalent of that screen. So I want to make sure you do that. And you should be able to, in addition to doing that, put the pages, put the example that I'm going to show you in a minute here in the proper directory and get the same results that I do. All right. So if you can do that, this example that we're going to look at in a minute here, if you can put it in the proper directory and get the same results that I do, then you probably have done it right. And you're in a position to handle the rest of the class, because the rest of the class will require, every assignment is going to require PHP for the remainder of the class. And every lab from lab 8 on down should include PHP code in it. I do get sometimes, and I should probably be more specific in some cases, where students do JavaScript versions of the labs that I want to be done in PHP. And shame on me for not being more specific, but from lab 8 on, it's done. And not to say that there will be no JavaScript, but the primary language to be used will be PHP. Now, why do we do something in JavaScript versus PHP? Or put differently, what are some things that we would do in PHP that we wouldn't do in JavaScript? Well, the things that are either A, secure, like for example, if you had an algorithm for doing a calculation that was proprietary to your organization and you wanted to keep that algorithm hidden from everyone else, then you would want to do it on the server, because the server is just going to send the results back to the client and it's not going to expose the algorithm. Things like validation, to enter in a password. Things like database interaction would be done in PHP. To put in broad terms, this is going to be returning data that is secured, stored in the database, and is difficult, if not impossible, to be accessed on the client side. Now, that being said, you got to walk before you run. So later on in the semester, we'll do an example, at least one example, that does database interactivity. But the first few examples that we give, you could do them in JavaScript and get similar results. Like the example I'm going to show you today, you could write a JavaScript version of it and it would produce similar results. We're not going to do that though, because we want to learn server-side scripting. So your first lab, which means to create a Mad Lib, where you enter words and it gets plugged into a poem or a joke or whatever, that is to be done in PHP. All right, as are the remainder of the labs. So now, here's examples I have, very simple. First example of PHP. All right, I have three sort of versions of the same example, and we'll start out with the most basic one. Now, remember, you can't double click it and open it up like you can an HTML file. This is something that a lot of people take a little bit of time to really fully understand. So if I double click it, Windows doesn't really know what to do with it. It kind of thinks that we want to use Visual Studio Code, but it's not. And even if we force it to be opened in the browser, funny, it lists Firefox, but not Chrome. Even if we force it to be open in a browser, we get the code. We don't get the results of the code like we want. So it's very important to open these through the web server. Now, how do you open a file through a web server? Well, every web server has a home directory. Now, by default, in IIS, that directory will be the folder C, inetpub, www-root. So this little thingy here, that's that page that we saw when we opened up localhost. So when we talk about local, when we type in localhost, we mean this folder here. So our pages need to be here. So I'm going to take this first example and copy it and put it in the web server root. And there we go. Now, how do I access it? Well, this is in the web server root. So all I would do is say localhost / and the name of the page, the full file name of the page. So in this case, I would say localhost / first.php. If it was in a subfolder, I would say localhost / the name of the subfolder, then / first.php. So we'll access this page, and this page just creates a little table. That shows a table of numbers squared. Could we do this in JavaScript? Sure. Could we do it in plain old HTML? Yeah, but I wouldn't want to make a 100-row table that contains a number and squared. I can do that arithmetic, but it's going to be work, right? Who wants to do work, especially on beautiful days like this? So this is a PHP script that does this. So PHP scripts are nothing but HTML mixed with PHP commands. So let's open up this PHP file. And if you notice, I like this already, right? We don't have 100 lines for the table. We have 23 lines of the whole code. So let's look at what this does. All right. Part of the page is plain old HTML. All right. That gets sent to the client as is. There's no translation need to be done with that. There's no execution that needs to be done. So the things that are not in this directive, the server interprets as plain HTML and just sends it to the server without any special processing. Now, we have this directive, PHP, $sign PHP, and then what closes that is a greater than sign. What that designates is everything between there and there is not plain old HTML, it's PHP code, right? It's PHP code. All right, let's look at what the PHP code does. Keep in mind, there's a couple ways you can do this. You might be thinking ahead, why do I have this in PHP code? We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. The first instruction says print a table tag. What that does is it outputs to the browser whatever we have included within the quotes. In this case, a table tag. The second line says print tr, th, number, nth, th squared, nth, ntr. So that is outputting the first row of the table. This right here. Then we have a loop. Loops in PHP work similar to the way that loops work in JavaScript and in C# and Java and other programming languages. This is a for next loop, for loop. All right. Now, one thing you might notice right off the bat is we don't declare variables as being a specific type. If we were doing this in C#, for example, we would say for int n equals. The other thing to notice is that variables are designated by a $sign. So we have $n equals 1. What that does is that creates a little variable for us and gives the initial value of 1. We're going to repeat this block of code as long as n is less than or equal to 100. So we're going to do it 100 times. First time through the loop, n is equal to 1. Second time through the loop, n is equal to 2. Third time in the loop, n is equal to 3. I'm going to do all 100 iterations. Fourth time through the, no, just kidding. Finally, the very last time, n is going to be equal to 100. The next time it tries to do the loop, n is going to be equal to 101. Hey, this no longer is true, then we drop out of the loop. And by the way, the one thing I forgot to mention, n++ means that each time through the loop, we increment n by 1. So this is going to execute 100 times. N is going to be 1 through 100 for each trip through the loop. I will probably say sometimes for the variable name n, I'll probably just slip and say n or $n. Yes.
If you wanted to print the $, would you have to ASCII, like?
Yeah, you'd have to escape it. Or you could do, there's a couple of ways that you could do it. You could, one quick and dirty way to do it is if I want to put a $sign before it. To do this would work as well. There's also a format statement where you can format code. I'll look that up in a second. So. Notice that the double quotes are what are called magic quotes. What that does is it's going to display the value of the variable wherever it sees a variable name. If I use the single quotes, those are not magic quotes. It's going to display what I have between the single quotes literally. So there's a dollar sign. To keep things simple, I'm just using the magic quotes because they are somewhat magical. Yes.
You have a question mark in the PHP tag. Is that necessary to?
This up here?
Yeah, up there to run the code.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the way that looks. That's the way that directive looks. And likewise, the end PHP directive is that.
Okay, but it doesn't do anything else than it just shows the code.
Well, what it does is it tells the web server that between here and here is not HTML, but it's PHP code. And therefore, the server has to execute that code. So the server knows that this is not plain old HTML. All right. Like if I don't do that, let's move this. All right, I get some goofy result. Why? Because the browser doesn't know that that's PHP code. So it thinks it's HTML. So instead, I'm going to put it between that, and then the web server will know that, hey, this is PHP code and you should execute it. Okay, here we square the number. We take the number times itself. And again, this is both this is kind of a weakness in JavaScript is JavaScript kind of figures out the type of data something is based on how you use it. So in this case, it knows that I've set this to 1 and it's going up by integers. Therefore, it assumes that this is going to be a numeric calculation and it does the calculation the way you'd expect. I then output out the result, and when I'm finally done with the loop, I output the end table tag. Now, if I look at the browser, if I do a view source, I'm not going to see the PHP code because the view source is the client's view. This is the code that got outputted by the PHP script. So you can see we outputted a table tag. We outputted this string of tags.
I'm using
Yeah,
Bixby
put it-
text call to convert your voice.
This, so on. So when you do a view source, it shows you what got delivered to the browser. And that's not going to be PHP code. It's going to be the HTML code that the PHP code generated. That's a very useful debugging step. So like if something isn't working the way that you think it is, look at the HTML code that got generated. Now you might think, well, how would I style that table? Well, you'd style it just the way you'd style any table, CSS. The fact that that table was created by PHP doesn't make any difference. So I could say something like table background gray. With 100%. And the table is gray and the width of it is 100%. So the fact that this table was created by PHP code as opposed to one that I manually typed in doesn't matter. The CSS code will still apply. Now, I said I would look up for the command to format. So I'll print F. Let's look, hopefully they have some examples. We can do that to output. And if we wanted to do a $sign in that, we could put the $sign in the string then, and it should be okay. All right. Any questions over this? This is something though that really benefits from PHP because again, you let the server do the calculations of the squares as opposed to you manually going and creating 100 rows with 100 squares in it. Now notice that I'm outputting two things. I'm outputting HTML code, well, and I'm outputting the data, and the data is included in HTML tags. I could actually do this a different way because I could put these tags anywhere I want to. So let's look at example number 2. Again, it has to be in my special directory, which again, it will be different for you if you were using XAMPP, but for me, it's CINET pub www root. So I'm going to copy first two to CINET pub www root, paste it in there. And I'm going to type in now first 2. And same thing, but I just used a slightly different technique in doing it. Let's look at how I did this. In this example, I jumped in and out of PHP mode. So notice in this example, I have the tag for the header and the tag for the table and the tag for the header. I just have the plain HTML for that. Likewise, the end table tag. I then have my for loop going around this block of code. And this block of code contains a mix of HTML and PHP stuff. Let's contrast that with the other one. In this one, I stayed in PHP mode through the whole creation of the table. Here, I pop in and out of PHP mode. Here's the loop. Here's the end of the loop. So these are the instructions that get executed over and over again. The TR and the TD are just plain old HTML that gets sent to the browser. They're not output from PHP. And I simply print the value of variable n and print the value of variable s. All right. Doesn't really matter. Use whatever seems clearer to you. All right. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Yes.
How does that still work? It's not even the same. It's like disconnected code.
Well, it's smart enough to know that this end brace belongs to this brace. And therefore, it knows that these lines of code get duplicated, are the code that's included in the body of the loop. So this code gets executed. Yeah, it's goofy. I remember being shocked when I saw that happen too. But you can do that with if statements. You can do that with for next statements where you can just pop out of PHP mode, have a block of HTML, and that HTML will get processed either as a loop or an if statement or whatever. Now, let's look at the third example. Oh, it doesn't matter to me which one of these techniques you use. First is a little awkward because you have to do a print statement to print out any of the tags that you want to send. This can be goofy for the very reason that you said. It's not always clear what belongs with what, especially if you start thinking of a very complicated code with if statements and loops and all that. It can get kind of dicey. Let's look at 3. This comes in a pair. This comes in with a form and PHP. Now in this case, first thing I'm calling is not first 3. First thing I'm calling is form at PHP. And I can specify a starting value and an ending value. So I'll put it a starting value of 20, an ending value of 60. And now this loop goes, instead of from 1 to 100, it goes from 20 through 60. So this is a form that's gathering data to send to a server-side script, which again is a very common thing. You know, that's what Google is, right? It's a form, a text box and a button that sends something to a server-side script. That is Google's search algorithm to come up with a list of results. So if I can put 1 to 100 in here, and it does 1 to 100, I can do 1 to 1,000. I always do that for fun, put in like really high numbers just to see how quick it goes. And there it is, 1,000 rows. All right, let's see how that works. The first part of it, the form, I hope is review for you. All right. And this is plain HTML. Now I have it as a PHP file, even though there's only HTML in it. That's okay. I can do that. If I'm doing a project with PHP, I'll make all my files PHP files, even if they only contain HTML. And we'll see a reason why I do that later on when we get into include files. So I have my form, which is as a form tag. Method is get, which means it's going to pass the data on the query string and action is first 3. Yes, there's a question? I don't know if we could hear you, if you could type it in the chat.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, sir?
I'll leave the chat window open, and if you could type in your question in the chat, I will address it. I'm going to continue on with the rest of this form page. Get means is the data is going to be sent on the query string, and we'll actually see what that means when we run this again. Action is the name of the PHP script that is going to get called. All right, I have my text box for the starting value, text box for the ending value. Notice the name is start for the start and the name is end for the end. As far as a PHP is concerned, the name is important, not the ID. So we're going to be looking for this data using the name. Now, hint, hint, spoiler alert, I use the same thing for the ID. That just helps keep things straight. As opposed to like, what was the ID? Then it doesn't matter. You get it right either way. Yes.
How can it be that it takes the name as an the ID? It's very strange.
Well, that's the way it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the way it is. Well, if you think about it, you know, for text box, it seems kind of odd, but when you think about it, if you had a drop down or if you had a radio button, each radio button may have its own ID, but what you want to send is you want to send the selected value from the whole radio button set. So that's why it sends it to by the name of the radio button.
Okay, makes sense.
All right, so this is submit button. And just a quick question. Do you need an index, HTML, and a form? Or can you just use the phone as the index? In this example that I'm doing, you need a form. You need two PHP pages. You need one that contains the form and one that contains the processing. Later on in the semester, we will get by with only having one file that contains both the form and the processing code. But I didn't want to get into that mess on the first day. So therefore, I'm keeping those two things separate. So in this example, yes, we have a form, and then we have a code that processes it. And then later on in the course, we'll get into where you just have one page that does both the form and the processing. Okay, so this is how we pull things from the request. And this works either way. There's a post and a get function as well, or array, I should say. But I use request because request works either way. So like in some examples, you might see this. Or And those work as well. But I would just use all right. Now, here is how we pull the value from the query string. So here we set that start variable to the value in query string called start. Here we set the end value as the value in the query string called end. And then we run the loop. Instead of being from 1 to 100, we start it at the start variable, go until the end variable, and increment n by 1 each time. So in this case, I type in 39 through 50. We look on the query string, pop this into we have the URL. That's the action of the form. First3.php. We have the question mark indicating the data is being set on the query string. Then we have start equals 39 because that was in the start, the thing with the name of start, and equals 50. And we get the value of the button to boot. So submit equals process. That's the actual value of the submit button, indicating that that was a button that's pressed. And that is relevant because you could have, for example, 2 buttons on a form. One that updated a piece of data, one that deleted the data. And if you did that, you know, you would need to know which button got pressed to know to do the update or to do the deletion. In this case, since there's only one button, we know since there's only one button, we know that we got to this page through that button. Now, I want to show you something, and I strongly urge you to do this too. So this should be part of your couple of weeks getting used to PHP. Let's say I have an error. I forget to put this in. All right. I go and run it. I get the very descriptive error that says the page isn't working. It's like, wow, that's a lot to go on, isn't it? Well, a couple of things here. Keep in mind that if you have a page in production, you don't necessarily want to display error messages where the outside world can see them, because there's always a potential that that will expose something about your system that you don't want known. So possibly expose something that you need to keep secure. But yet, as a debugger and as a programmer trying to debug this, we need better than this page isn't working. Fortunately for us, there is a file called the PHP ini file. And I'm going to search for it, php.ini. It's doing a search. I'm going to go a little bit longer today. This will make up for all the times that I ended short. Because I do want to show you this because it's important to get better debugging messages than just this page doesn't work.
noticed that you do like the form, it passes the variables through the URL.
Yes.
Can you hide that, or is that?
Yeah, that would be the method of get. And that will pass it as part of the request object. That's not in the URL. The first several examples I do the post, wait a minute, did I say get? That's a method of post. This was a method of get. I do the get examples just because I think that's easy to see how that gets put there. So I hope it's going to find it. I know there's one out there. Okay, yay, here it is. So I'm going to open this up. Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to scroll down, or we could do a search. There we go, error handling and logging. Display errors. Display errors is set to off. And again, error output is very useful during development when you're debugging, right? But could be dangerous in a production environment. Sensitive information could potentially leak out of your application. So, but hey, we're in development mode. We're going to switch to on display errors. And I'm going to save this.
Yeah, just hit the check mark.
I'm going to save it on the desktop because it's not allowing me to save. They don't trust us to be administrators on these machines. So, you know, because obviously how many years in the IT business? 40 years for me. I don't think that's, I'm sorry, breaking. All right, and where was that? That was in program files. Okay, there it is. It's the file. Okay, there we go. Now, at least gives you a fighting chance of getting it right. It still isn't, you know, you'd wish that the error message would just say, hey, you forgot an ending brace. But it tells you that there's an unclosed brace on line 19. So we can look at line 19. In the source code. Say, okay, 19 is our for loop. Oh, we didn't close the for loop. Where should the close be? Down here. If you remember, I'm looking at a different copy of it. I had deleted that in the version that we're running in CINet Pub. So yeah, oh, okay, it's missing that. I can put it in. So that's the other thing I recommend you doing. So things to get ready for this week, over the next week. Number one, install a web server if you don't already have it. Install a web server with PHP if you don't already have it. Be able to run these examples like I showed. That means you're going to have to find the directory that you need to move the files to and make sure you understand how to execute PHP. Number two, deliberately delete something out of the PHP that's going to cause an error, like for example, that bracket, and make sure your air reporting is on, and that will help you tons throughout the semester. You, believe it or not, know enough to do the first lab in PHP. All right, because all the lab in PHP does is takes data from a form and displays it on the screen, essentially. So you can go ahead and work on that if you want. Okay. I think I answered this question. You could put everything in one page, but for this example, for simplicity, I have a form page and the code that processes it in separate pages. If that's not the question that you intended, pop on to WebEx during lab, and we can hash it out. All right. Have a great break. We will see you either in lab